Thank you so much for joining us for the second annual workshop on social equity and public policy. My name is Shahjahan Bhuiyan. I'm Professor of Public Administration and Associate Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So today we are joined by some distinguished panelists, as you see here, Professor Mary Guy, Her Excellency Nivin El-Kabbaj, Dean Yijia Jing, and Sean McCandless, and also I'm with my colleague Noura Wahabi, Assistant Professor of Public Administration in the Department of Public Policy and Administration. And also on the screen is Professor Jozef Raadschelders from the Ohio State University. Thank you, Josh, for joining us. As you know, we lost one of the pillar of our School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as distinguished faculty in the Department of Public Policy and Administration, Dr. Laila Baradai, in a road accident on April 18th last month. So we will begin our today's workshop by in 1 minute silence in honor of Dr. Laila Baradai. In the loving memory to Dr. Laila Baradai. Dean Nohal Mikawi is not feeling well, so she is unable to join us. She apologizes for her inability to join this workshop, but she sends her best regards to all of you, particularly our panelists who kindly came here in order to make this workshop successful. So let me hand over this one to Noura and in order to introduce our panelists. Yeah, I can do the opening remarks, I think. So it was supposed to be by Dean Noha, so in any case, let me do it. So good afternoon once again. Welcome. I myself and my colleagues are deeply grateful to you for your kind presence to this important event, the second annual workshop on social equity in public policy. As you know, social equity is a contesting concept, but equity is believed to be the core of production and dissemination of knowledge across academic disciplines. In the context of a nation state, whom knowledge is diverse and inclusive, it helps governments to identify problems and to seek for their socially equitable solutions for the benefits of their citizens. Public administration as an academic discipline is discharging this critical responsibility dating to the early days of the field. Dwight Waldo, an American political scientist and perhaps the most defining figure in the field of public administration, who first described the influence of social equity on the body of public administration as a ductless gland, a subtle but important influence in the field. George Fredrickson opines that the search for social equity provides public administration with a real normative base. In this particular milieu, the definition of social equity that has been advanced by Johnson and Savara is deemed useful. Is the active commitment to fairness, justice, and equality in the formation of public policy, distribution of public services, implementation of public policy, and management of all institutions service the public directly or by contract. Public administration, including all persons involved in public governance, should seek to prevent and reduce inequality, injustice based on significant social characteristics, and to promote greater equality in access to services, procedural fairness, quality of service, and social outcomes. The purpose of today's workshop is to further the discussion that we began here at the IUC School of Global Affairs and Public Policy last year. Our distinguished panelists, who are well-known scholars in the field of global importance, will discuss the issues from their respective lines of research. And I think social equity is now an important issue than any other time where, as you see, what is happening in many developed countries, including in the US. So the topics they are about to discuss are broad and diverse, but touches the heart of the problems. We do hope that we will make this roundtable an annual forum of debate and discussions to contribute to make a better world where we aspire to live in a just society. Again, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. My gratitude is to Dean Nohal Mikawi for allowing me to organize this event, and to my colleague, Monica Vasily, for smooth sailing the boat. It won't be possible to organize this event without our help, as well as the support of our IT colleagues and everyone who supported us in many different ways. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Shahjahan, for the opening remarks. Welcome everybody to, again, the second installation of this forum. Last year we had a great lineup to kind of launch this idea of social equity and what it means globally, but also in a local context and in the global South. What are some of the differences, the similarities of this concept? Now we're in a very different global kind of moment with what the changes that we've been seeing in the US and Europe, but also in the region as well. We have a similarly spectacular lineup today, and speakers who are going to take us from the global level to local context as well, to really think about what this concept means in this kind of era of democratic backsliding that we've seen recently. So to start us off, we have Dr. Jozef Raadschelders. Dr. Jozef is the professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University. He's been a faculty member there since 2011, and he served as Associate Dean of Faculty Development from 2013 to 2023. He was previously at the University of Leiden and also at the University of Oklahoma. He served as managing editor of Public Administration Review, which most of us are familiar with, one of the top journals in the field. And he's also a co-editor of the same journal since last year. He's also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And he researches and teaches on public administration theories, history of government, comparative government, and civil service systems. He's written more than 140 articles and books. He's really written extensively on the study of public administration and as an academic pursuit specifically. So Dr. Joss is going to start off to help us think through social equity in the larger public administration literature and scholarship. And the title of his presentation is The Study of Public Administration in Time, Past, Present, Future of Endeavor of Fairness, which is always in flux. So Dr. Joss, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And let me say up front that I would have loved to be there. But when I heard late February, mid-March, that a French physicist was denied entry into the United States because materials were discovered on his iPhone and laptop that were critical of the current administration, I thought, well, maybe it's not so smart to go. The deans at OSU advised early April that non-American residents as faculty should not leave the country. So I'm stuck here. I would have loved to be there. I know several of you, and I met Shahjahan at ASPA. So I'm looking forward to this workshop. We are an interesting species. Huh? If you think about the fact that we have only been roaming this earth as Homo sapiens the past 200,000-300,000 years or so, and when we did, think of the Earth's land masses as pretty empty, occupied by little pockets of people, 30 to 50 individuals. And that was the case for most of our existence. Right? And we lived in these small groups because that was the only way that we could survive. Why? Just look at yourselves when you're standing upright. Right? a lot of the great apes walk on all fours. But when you stand upright, the most vulnerable part of your body, that is from your trunk, is exposed. We don't have claws. We don't have the speed of a cheetah. We don't have the teeth of a saber-toothed tiger. We're very vulnerable. And the only way that our species could survive is by sharing and caring for one another, and that is where that equity issue comes in. So, when people live in small groups, that sharing and caring for one another is unavoidable, because that is the only way that we can survive. But it is because of, in part, the agricultural transition. I will not call it revolution, because that's not what it was. It took more than 10,000 years to learn how to domesticate cattle and all sorts of grains. It is not until some 12,000 years ago that people started living in larger groups and became sedentary. They invested in growing grains and raising cattle, and that sedentary life meant that they were able to produce surplus, so to speak. So they didn't move, they didn't live a nomadic life anymore. And as you produce a surplus, populations can grow. And it is about some 6,000 years ago that people start living in communities that are larger than the physical communities in which people in prehistory have lived for most of our existence. So when people start living in what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities, and what Bertrand Russell called in 1932 artificial societies, we need systems of government. And it is then, from then on, that sometimes, at some point, people start thinking about social equity. So hang on, can you go one slide back, please? Yeah. So I will first talk about ideas with regards to governing and government, as that was found in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian, Babylonian literatures. Then about good government as embodied in a person, the person of a ruler, which is something, and I apologize to you, at a European periodization, something that was the case from antiquity up to the Middle Ages. Then move into good government as an abstraction and what good government stands for. And that is when that social equity theme comes back in as well. And then finally about social equity over time. And I have a table in the paper that I sent to Shahjahan that I could not load up in the PowerPoint because it didn't fit. But take a look at it if it is of your interest. Now, people don't think about good government when they live in these small groups in caves of, say, 50 people, maybe 100, 150, but that was it. The only way, as I said earlier, that you could survive is by collaborating with one another and taking care of one another. Now, that taking care goes quite a way. And actually includes brain operations. We have seen that through archaeologist excavations and people got bone repairs, all sorts of things that people did to help those who were weaker in their community. Now, people start thinking about governing and what good government is from, I would say, about 5,000 years ago. I have a big book at home, Oxford University Press. First edition was published in 1955, and the second expanded edition in 1969. That's the one that I have. That provides an overview of ancient sources of the Old Testament. And as it turns out, the Old Testament contains a variety of wisdoms and instructions that come straight out of southern Babylonian and ancient Egyptian literatures. That part of the literature, because there's all sorts of other writing, chants and hymns, more religiously inspired, but there is a variety of instruction literature or wisdom literature where people are advised about how to behave themselves in relation to one another. So one of the earliest that I know of is by Il-Imhotep, who is a high-ranking official in the reign of the pharaohs Djoser and Hordedef. And he wrote an instruction for the then Prince Hordedef that he, and I quote, should not be boastful before my very eyes, and beware of the boasting of another. More famous is the instruction of the vizier Ptahhotep, who served the pharaoh Djedkari Isese, and this is the late 25th to the mid 24th century before the Common Era. And he writes, let not thy heart be puffed up because of thy knowledge. If thou art a leader commanding the affairs of the multitude, seek out for thyself every beneficial need, until it may be that thy own affairs are without wrong. Justice is great, and its appropriateness is lasting. There's a variety of these wisdoms that you can find. Yes, this is the next slide that you can find in that ancient literature. And all of these instructions, and there's quite a few of them, point out the importance of patience, respect, justice, fairness, righteousness, and temperance, and especially the last one in contrast to greed. So these ancient Egyptian and Babylonian texts reach the rulers, that is Pharaoh, as well as the Lugals, that's the name for kings in southern Babylonia, ancient Mesopotamia, and a lot of them issue rulings or codes of law. That started roughly the 22nd century before the Common Era. Preceding that are the reforms by King Urukagina of Lagash and Girsu. And he pursues reforms to combat corruption and usury, as you can see on the slide. Why? Well, a large part of the population was in debt, and it's been reported in the literature that southern Mesopotamian kings of city-states had major crises. It was not just in Lagash and Girsu, but it was everywhere. Yeah, and that had to do with the lending practices, that people could charge lenders up to 20-30% interest. By the way, for those of you who do not know this, banks in the United States can charge between 20 to 30% interest on debts that people have. So maybe things have not changed all that much. But anyway, Urukagina pursued reforms in order to exempt widows and orphans from taxes, so to protect the weak, and to limit the power of the priesthood and large property holders. His reforms have been called something similar to a Bill of Rights, and he sets the tone for various law codes that follow then. So the next slide, please. The first law code is that by Ur-Namma, who is a king that unites Sumer and Akkad, and the oldest law code focusing on protecting the weak. Now, law codes in southern Mesopotamia are centered around the notion or the concept of misharum, which has to do with equity, yeah, and is an effort to bring balance, to balance human affairs with natural law. And a king at the beginning of his reign would announce such a misharum in the hopes of alleviating financial hardships that were created by previous rulers. And the ancient law codes, including the most famous one, that of Hammurabi, contains such a misharum, the prologue of the law codes, and you see then what these law codes emphasize. Now, next slide, please. Yeah. So, good government is something where people thought about good government in terms of personal behavior. Then it became an interest in the abstraction at the local level. And then it became something that was more, call it nationalized, if you will. So I already mentioned the instructional wisdom literature and misharum in ancient Babylonia. In ancient Egypt, it is ma'at, and this will be a concept that for most Egyptians in the audience will be familiar concerning justice and truth. And you see there a variety of values, moral values that people consider to be important for public servants in their behavior towards people. These end into instructions for rulers. Now, I don't know of any instructions other than small instructions regarding personal behavior, some of which I cited just now. But the more involved ones are those by Kautilya, by Seneca, by Thomas Aquinas, and then the most famous one, Machiavelli. Yeah, and this idea is good government the government is embodied in the ruler, and it is the benevolence of the ruler that will make government good. Yeah. So government and the quality of government depends entirely upon the ruler. Now, these ancient law codes translate slowly into training of law, but the ancient law codes are not followed by schools of law, people getting training in law until the 3rd century before the Common Era in ancient India and in ancient China. Next slide, please. So, good government relied on the personal behavior of rulers, and some did well, others did not do so well. History is full of the latter. Local government, in other words, or government in general, was considered a property. If government is embodied in the person of a ruler, it is a property that she, think of Cleopatra, and he, generally the case, are responsible for. That changes, and it changes in steps. And as far as I know, the place where it changes first is at the local level in Western Europe. Local government, just as the government of a city-state in the ancient world, was considered the property of an individual. In this case, in Western Europe, a feudal lord. In 2 steps, local governments established independence from feudal lords. In the 7th and 8th century of the Common Era, think around the time of Charlemagne, a variety of towns acquired market rights. Most of those market rights were annual market rights, but increasingly market rights expanded to become a weekly right, in exchange, of course, for a fee or for a percentage of the revenue raised during the market. That created some degree of independence from those feudal lords. And then since the 11th century, and you see that on the slide, cities acquire town charters that you could call a constitution of the local government. So this started in Italy in the 11th century, and then it moved to France, England, the German lands in the 12th century, and to the Low Countries, what is nowadays the Netherlands and Belgium, in the 13th century. And it is from then on that local towns and markets are no longer treated as the property of an individual, but as the property of a community that is represented by mayors, council members, and aldermen. And there you see emerging government as an abstraction. It is then no wonder that 10 years before the Black Death, in the middle of the 14th century, Ambrogio Lorenzetti paints the allegory of bad government and the allegory of good government in the town hall of Siena in Italy. Yeah? And that type of government as embodied in an abstraction, is something that already then exists for 2 centuries in northern Italy. Yeah? That also means that you see the first shimmerings of the focus about the position and role of government in society, moving from the role and position of the ruler as an embodiment of government to government as an abstraction. Next slide, please.
Professor Jos, there's 10 minutes. Yeah? 10 minutes to go.
10 minutes? Yeah, I have a watch in front of me.
Great.
The first to talk and write about government as an abstraction in general, not just the local level, is Antonio Serra in southern Italy. He lived in Naples. He was born south of Naples, but he lived in Naples, and he was in prison when he wrote this little book in 1613 called the Breve Trattato, a brief treatise. And he was wondering why Naples as a local government was so far behind in terms of economic development when compared to Siena, Milan, Florence, Genoa, Torino, Venice, all the cities in northern Italy. And he concluded, as he was thinking about this, that it had to do with 4 elements. First, he said it was important to have a diversified economy and not depend on one product or one type of activity. So in his day and age, it was agriculture, trade and commerce and crafts. He thought connectivity between local communities was important to advance trade. Yeah? So canals, roads, and harbors. He felt that an enterprising population was important, an educated population. And he ended up by saying that the main reason that a local community could economically develop itself was effective government. In his little booklet, and it was translated into English in 2011, I knew of its existence, but I don't speak Italian. So I read it, and he makes a distinction between proper accidents and common accidents. And proper accidents are natural conditions. So there's weather patterns, the quality of the soil. There's not much you can do about it. But the proper accidents, the common accidents, you can do something about. You can diversify an economy. You can educate the population. You can establish connectivity and good government, which, and there's the quote you see, is the controlling superior cause of all the other common accidents as it organizes, introduces, causes, improves, and preserves the other common accidents. There you go. That set of ideas is supported by a variety of his contemporaries, and you'll see the same idea continue into writing in the 17th and 18th century by English, German, and French authors, yeah, among whom Adam Smith of The Wealth of Nations. The poor guy has been horribly misunderstood as the father of the free market, but for those of you who have gone through that pretty sizable tome, I'm looking at it right now, The Wealth of Nations, he was more concerned about what he called the tribes of monopoly than thinking about free markets. So go to the next slide. Yeah. Things were pretty unchanging for millennia. Yeah? Bureaucracies first emerged in those city-states in support of those in power, that is the economic and the political elites. Those in bureaucracy served those rulers and the ruling elite, not the people. That changes only some 250 years ago, and I briefly described those in the paper, those changes, at the constitutional, collective, and operational level. It's a distinction that Eleanor Ostrom and Larry Kaiser made more than 40 years ago. Now, at the constitutional level, separation of politics and administration, state and market, state and church, and the introduction of constitutions. This happened in a span of a couple of decades. Yeah, I don't think we appreciate fully how fast that was as a reform and how widespread it became in a very short span of time. Hegel is the first to write about the civil servant, not as someone who is subservient to rulers, but subservient to the people at large. And those changes in bureaucracy and in civil service, I describe further in that table in more detail. Next slide, please. So the study of public administration, you could argue that thinking about government started about thinking about the role and position of the ruler in a society in relation to its citizens, right? But a study of public administration, as we understand it, started in the 17th and 18th century in France and the German lands. And the focus in those 2 centuries was on the position and role of government in society and whether government could provide what the Germans called Glückseligkeit, happiness and well-being. In the late 19th century, the attention in public administration shifts to efficiency, intriguingly. Yeah? So in the 17th and 18th century, the focus is much more on equity and well-being and what Aristotle called eudaimonia. In the late 19th century, the attention shifts to efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. And you see that shift in the writing of Woodrow Wilson. His early writing is all about democracy and equity. And when he's running for office, for the governorship of New Jersey, for the president of the US, he is all about efficiency. Goes to show that people are affected by the zeitgeist. And in this case, the zeitgeist was that of Frederick Winslow Taylor and his efforts to improve efficiency. PA as a study in the 20th century is one that focuses a lot on skills, techniques, and instruments, on leadership, But we should not forget attention for big questions. And I think we are at a time that attention for civicness and civic education, for democracy, well, you see it on the slide, is more important than ever. When I was 20, I never thought about democracy and about what it meant to be a citizen. And I find now, 50 years later, that we cannot take democracy for granted. And the issue of equity, that is something that is, in my view, about sharing and caring, sharing with one another and caring for one another on a basis of equity is indeed more important than ever. Maybe we need to rediscover our prehistoric roots. I think I'll leave it at that. And I'm willing to answer any questions people might have or listen to other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Jos. I think this was a great start to have us start thinking about the roots and the origins of government across the world. And also how social equity kind of plays into that as one of the key tenets of governing and government. So our next speaker is Professor Mary E. Guy. Professor Mary is a distinguished professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, at the School of Public Affairs. She teaches on public administration, public management, organizational behavior, human resource management. She has written widely about emotional labor, maybe wildly also, but and especially in regards to emotionally intense work demands. She's written on social equity, workforce diversity, the difference that gender makes in policy development and implementation. She's also a fellow at NAPA. She's a founding co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration, which was launched in the last couple of years. She was the past president of the American Society for Public Administration, and she's, of course, recipient of numerous awards for her leadership, research, and mentoring in our field. So over to you, Professor Mary. The presentation is going to focus on the evolution of three concepts in American public service: social equity, gender equity, and emotional labor.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say first about how honored I am to be here and to talk to you today about three topics that I have spent decades researching and writing about. But before I start, let me just say this. I had looked so forward to meeting Professor Alberdi. We had the pleasure in the Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration to publish a paper that she had co-authored, a paper about the use of social media in advancing sustainable development goals. And it gave JCEPA's, and it gives JCEPA's readers a look at what is going on in this region, a region that Americans certainly are pretty naive about. And I will just tell you this, that obviously fate did what fate does, and she is no longer with us. But the tributes that I have seen posted by American scholars about her tells me what a fabulous human being she was, what an excellent scholar, and what a compassionate soul. So I congratulate you for having had the wonderful pleasure of knowing her. So let me proceed. I'm going to talk to you about social equity in general. I'm going to pick up pretty much where Jos just dropped off. And then I'm going to speak about a particular dimension of social equity, that is gender equity. And then I'm going to talk to you about that very human connection that happens when state meets citizen and when citizen meets state, and that's emotional labor. So first, we'll talk about social equity. From the American point of view, and I speak to you as an American, that's what I know, but as you all know, pick and choose what works for you in your context. This whole understanding about what equity is and priorities is so contextual. It is so culturally bound, and it changes over time. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that, certainly from the American understandings. But we think of public administration as having 4 imperatives, and that is that our services, our policies and our decisions and our services should be economical, should be efficient, should be effective, and should be equitable. And equitable means not just in the outcomes, although that's very, very important, but also in the processes by which decisions are made and the kinds of variable considerations that come into view and the voices that are heard when decisions are being made. So social equity is contextual. It changes according to place. It also changes according to the context and the needs of the time. So in some cultures and in some times, equity is an issue about how various tribes are treated. In others, it deals with race and how race matters. In others, it is focusing on color and the range of and colorism from the darkest of skin to the lightest of skin. In other times, other groups were talking about age and how the elderly are treated compared to the youngest are treated. And other times we're talking about gender and all dimensions on the continuum of gender from masculine to feminine. And others we're talking about wealth, and others we're talking about education, and we advantage those with more education and disadvantage those with less. And others it's about religion, and others it's about ableism and who is physically able to walk and who is in a wheelchair and what accommodations we make. And others it's caste, and others it's occupation. Every culture advantages some occupations and disadvantages usually the dirty work, the work we don't like to think about. So it is contextual. And when someone is talking to you about social equity, make sure that you understand how they're coming at the subject before you can even assume that you're on the same page. So here is this is a purely American view of how the understanding of social equity has evolved over the last 250 years. You heard Joe speak to Woodrow Wilson's writings and how at one point he was talking about equity when he was, and this is right about 1900, when Wilson was interpreting equity to really mean what we now think of as equality. And then his interests changed as he was running for president and so forth. But what you see here is when the US was founded, the men who wrote the Constitution wrote it for themselves. Women were property. Legally, they were property. They were not writing about women. They were not writing about people of color. They were not writing about renters. They were writing about landed white men. And they all wanted equity for themselves. Well, what has happened is we have taken, the words work for whatever group you're talking about. So as time has evolved, we have used those words to expand it, to think women matter too, persons of color matter too. And we've broadened it and broadened it. But pushback happened, and pushback happened in the mid to late 1800s, once equity had been achieved by law for blacks. This was after the Civil War. In fact, there was pushback by the white men saying, no, the black men shouldn't have all the privileges that white men have. That was pushback. I tell you that because we are in the US in a period of pushback now. By the 1930s, equity had expanded and expanded to embrace the needs of women, the needs of men, regardless of race. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 then was a seminal piece of legislation because it expanded equality, and from that we extract equity based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. It was the most encompassing statement that the nation had ever made. And then in terms of the canon, that our public administration literature, it was in in 1968 that a conference was held at the Minnebrook Conference Center in upstate New York. And we talk about the Minnebrook Conference because that was the first formalized time in American public administration scholarship where social equity was legitimated as that fourth imperative that was so important. From that time on, we have extended the notion of what equity means, and we were having a pretty good time with that up until the last, say, year or so, all right? So let's talk about what happens. Pushback. Pushback happens. Social change happens. And it is always, over time, typically it's met with enthusiasm by those, even those who've been advantaged by the older system. But they'll pull their elbows in a little bit and do that long enough until they realize that power has been lost. And then the pushback happens. It happens in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Central and South America. You'll know better. You can tell me what's happening here in Egypt. But pushback happens. It's part of being human, living in community. And the best thing I can say is just be ready for it. Just know that it's a pretty normal process. So that's the social equity and general piece. Let me speak to you now about gender equity. Gender equity is an issue that arises in every culture I have ever studied, every culture any anthropologist has studied. In the American, and it plays out differently in different cultures. In the American context, the telltale signs of gender inequity are measured most easily in the workplace. So when we see job segregation, where there are certain jobs that women always hold, and there are other jobs that men always hold. I call that mom work versus dad work, because there's a whole set of expectations and norms about how the woman job holder is supposed to behave compared to how the male job holder is supposed to behave. We can also measure it just in dollars and cents, where you know that there is gender inequity when you see women being paid less for the same kind of work that the men are performing. You'll also know that it exists when you see differential power levels, when the man's voice has more weight, gets listened to more than the woman's voice, or when the woman's voice is described as shrill, but the man's voice is described as assertive. And when you hear these languages, let the antenna go up. You know what you're dealing with. So I was curious, so I tried to find some information on Egypt, and I found some World Bank data collected last year, looking at the labor force participation rate. So here, according to the World Bank data, you have 73% of all men and 18% of all women in the labor force, meaning they're either employed or they are looking for work and they would like to be employed. That's a pretty wide disparity. So I thought, okay, what does it compare to in the US? In the US, and we're not happy, certainly women aren't happy with the state of gender equity in the US, but you've got about 68% of men in the labor force, and you have 58% of women in the labor force, and we're still fussing about it. So you look at the differences, and it provides some interesting kinds of insights. So I went further then, and I found the National Strategy for the Empowerment of Egyptian Women and the goals for 2030. And those goals are to increase women in leadership roles, to enhance workforce equality and participation, to ensure women's rights, and to promote gender equality through legal frameworks. But there are three big hurdles that this report pointed out in order to overcome the inequities, one being affordable child care. And if you solve it here, let us know in the US. It is such a problem. Another hurdle is addressing gender-based violence, and another one was promoting safe transportation to and from work. I mean, these are big hurdles. They are achievable, and they are things. You can fix things. It's a lot easier to fix things than it is to change norms and attitudes and values. So this is the way I understand equity, and this is the way I understand inequity. If you see here, you simply see a picture. You see a beautiful room, and then you see the inside workings of it, the scaffolding, the internal architecture that nobody sees. Like this room, this is a lovely room. We take it for granted. We pay no attention to all of the rafters and the artifacts and the substrate under this floor that makes it so lovely. That's the same way we live our lives in the culture. We pay no attention to the values and the norms that give rise to what the room looks like. But we need to, and that's what we have to do when we're trying to address problems of inequity. We have to say, well, what are the rafters? What's behind the sheetrock? What's behind the walls? Because that's what's shaping the attitudes and the norms that perpetuate inequity. My bottom line is the same as Joseph was talking about, good government. The purpose of good government is to simply be a form of collective action to create safety and shelter and the best life that people can live. It's plain and simple. It exists for people. That's what it's about. And ideally, it does that in such a way that we create a bouquet of humanity where we embrace people as they are. We embrace them for whatever they bring, for their points of view, for the color of their skin, for their religions, for their beliefs, for what they can contribute, for what is meaningful to them, and we simply create a way to live together in harmony. That's the best that government can be. It sounds so simple, but it is so hard, which is what this workshop is all about. So let me move into that very human part of public administration, of what happens when citizen meets state, of what happens when state meets citizen. It is civil servants, government workers, who are the hands and feet of government. They are government from the point of view of those who receive services. And there are three kinds of labor. There's manual labor, physical labor. There's cognitive labor, which is what this is what you're learning at the university. You have your textbooks, you have chapter after chapter after chapter talking to you about things and principles and ideas. But there's an entire third kind of labor that has to be performed if the work is meaningful and humane, and that's the emotional labor, the emotive component. It's emotion that makes the gears work. It's emotion that causes you to feel good when you leave class and say, I made a good comment, I belong in that class, and makes you want to go back to the class the next time. It's emotion that causes the person working all day for the city to know that they made a difference in someone's life, to know that their work was hard, but it was good work, and they want to go back and do it the next day. That's all feelings. And my argument has been, and I think as public administrators, the field has gotten more open to considering and acknowledging the role of emotion in delivering services and in providing meaningfulness of those who do government. In a nutshell, emotion is far more powerful than cognition. you'll remember how you felt from an interaction far longer than you will remember a particular principle or a particular line on a budget ledger. It's there, it's very powerful. Pay attention to it. It's part of the work. You can't do good government without it. Emotional labor, the definition is, it is the awareness and management of your own emotion as well as the emotional state of the other person in order to get the job done. It is work-related, but it's the feeling part that goes with it. So, in terms of takeaways, I've talked to you briefly about social equity in general. I've talked to you about gender equity, and I've talked to you about emotional labor. In terms of social equity, equity is a way of thinking. It is a priority. That when you think of always saying, is this program equitable? Is this decision process equitable? Are these outcomes equitable? You know you're doing government right. Social equity is a journey. It's not an end. You can't just get there and have an equitable program and go, oh, good, we're done. Because things change, people's needs change, your resources change. It is a journey. It requires work, and it will be met by pushback sooner or later. Just be ready for it. Surround yourself with allies and advocates. It's work. Gender equity is always going to be with us. There are tensions. Women's ways of knowing are different from men's ways of knowing. And the battle for power is the battle between the sexes in every culture. It is there. Just acknowledge it, be of it, and understand it. In terms of the emotive component in public service, I think it opens each one of us to a far richer experience than when we're only looking at the cognitive part of our work in delivering public services. And to do so then more honestly accounts for people's experience, for the people you are delivering services to, as well as for you, the service deliverer. And it allows for a more holistic experience where you can talk about what you think and how you feel, and you know you're capturing what it is to be a part of government and helping people live their lives. Because at its essence, good government is simply about figuring out how we can live in harmony and how to help people live their lives as best they can. So, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mary. I think that's a great, great succinct and to the point explanation of how we think about social equity, how we can think about gender equity, and also emotional labor. Our third speaker is bringing us back to Egypt. So Her Excellency Nivin El-Kabbaj. She served as the Minister of Social Solidarity from 2019 to 2025. During her time as minister, she oversaw the implementation of the country's largest social protection programs, Tekeful and Karama, but also saw an overhaul of governance practices across the ministry and social protection institutions. She has more than 25 years of experience in development policies, social protection, childhood protection, strategic management, and planning, monitoring and evaluation. Before becoming minister, she was also serving as an advisor to the ministry from 2015 to 2018. She's held several positions. We know her in many different spaces, but in international bodies such as UNICEF, the American Development Association, the American National Council for Women, and also at the national level with the National Council for Childhood and Motherhood as policy planning and mentoring mentoring advisor, and she has also founded the first Egyptian research and evaluation network, and she was the first chairperson of that network. And speaking us today, she'll tell us a little bit more on bridging inequality, looking at Egypt's social policies in a changing landscape.
Good evening, everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today with such distinguished panelists and attendees. It's a great pleasure to link and reflect after a long journey of practitioners. So it's good to reflect again and to return back, not as a policymaker or as a practitioner, but as a thinker and academic with you. So my presentation is going to be about bridging inequalities, social policies in a changing landscape, and it's the journey of 10 years. But it's not only 10 years, because I used to work on social policies at UNICEF, so there are great differences and great leaps that happened during the previous period I'm going to share you with, but I'd like just to start with paying condolences to the department for the loss of a dear professor, mentor, scholar, human, mother, that we all feel about her loss, and her contribution to the faculty and to education at large is well acquainted and acknowledged. We all know that she was a person of a mission, not only as a professor, and she paid relentless efforts to build a better society through knowledge, dialogue, integrity. So we all miss her with great sorrow, but her impact will never be forgotten. We're speaking about opening remarks before getting into my speech about general statements that I'd like to share with you about Egypt at large, especially with regards to inequities. Although the official numbers and statistics say that Egypt has made marked improvements over the past decades in relation to reducing inequalities, and scored as moderate. It's even reported that Egypt registers one of the most or largest rank improvement of the global levels, and we agree that there is a sort of improvement, but still we challenge how inequality is measured. First, because we have a problem of especially measuring top incomes, and the other one is that we're not paying multidimensional approach in measuring inequality. We depend mainly on income, but there are other sources of data like wealth, assets, banking accounts, income. So I think the way of measuring and the methodology of measuring inequality needs to be revised. Inequality outcomes in Egypt exhibits a decreasing trend, but we're also speaking about equality of opportunities, and this is where we have a major challenge, because we're not speaking about absolute poverty, but generational poverty. If I'm born in a geographic area that is structurally poor, or I belong to a family that is generationally poor, then I have more chances to inherit this, and it's going to be a vicious circle of inherited inequality and inherited poverty. So this would eventually have implications on social mobility and political participation and on growth process at large. Inequality is reproduced through linkages with other sources of inequality. So what Mary spoke about, emotional or gender inequality or income inequality, we can find these structures as linked together and associated in terms of having replicated not only one person, but across generations. And eventually, it will inhibit investment in human capital and entrenching generational and structural poverty. Let's link between poverty and inequality. Are they the same concept? Not every poor person. Let us say that the poor or poverty at large typically experience, those who experience poverty typically experience inequality as well, or multiple sources of inequalities, but not the vice versa. Because I might have wealth and have very good income, but I'm a person with disability, or I'm a woman, or whatever type of inequality I have. So it's not about those who experience inequality are not necessarily poor, but mostly the poor, and often the poor, they also suffer from inequality. Let's speak about the situation and manifestation about the situation in Egypt at large. Egypt, I'm speaking about before 2014, and why 2014 and 2015? Because that's the turning point in the country establishing long way of social protection and of expanding social safety net to Egypt in order to decrease inequalities. And remember that the two revolutions have called for social justice. So one of the main legitimacy of the current government is to have social justice well established in its policies, and that's why we find many policies that are taking place. Before, the situation that was 77% or nearly 80% of the wealth was extremely concentrated on the hands of the top 10% of the population. So it's the top decile. They have, I mean, the subsidy actually consumed large portion of the budget. It was around subsidies consumed 30% of the state budget and around 8 to 10% of GDP. But who is benefiting from these subsidies? And before it was universal subsidies, and that's why the new policy come to have it more of targeted subsidy. So the top percent of the income group captures 60% of total subsidy budget that are not necessarily benefiting the poor. 20% of the lowest poor received less than 10%. So we will find that around 75% of the total subsidy were oriented to energy subsidy. That is benefiting more of the richest deciles and quintiles. Health and education services, which is investment in human capital and to help people to get out of poverty and get out of inequality and be quite prepared and quite equipped to move to more equality, were less invested in and were suffering from inefficient systems. So this was the whole situation. So we have manifestation of inequalities in Egypt. The Gini coefficient for wage inequality, it was 0.33 in 2000 and in 1988, and then increased in 0.43 in 2012. And then it is forecasted to decrease again after the whole situation. It's not only to Egypt, but to the whole world, as we are seeing right now happening. The unemployment was 13% in general, but it was 24% for women. So we will always find that the unemployment rate is getting double the unemployment for women. Mind you that a big portion of women are working on a casual labor or seasonal labor or informal labor, which means they are not protected with any sort of social protection, and they are liable for different types of inequities and lack of security. The informal employment reached 60%, and this is actually part of it with the business sector, part of it is not the business sector, but we'll find that this casual labor or informal labor is again not protected with any sort of insurance. It's not only social insurance, but it's also health insurance and all other types of social protection. The tax policy is regressive, which means that low-income groups more burdened with the VAT rather than the wealthier, who benefit from exemptions and incentives. So the 14% is applied for all the deciles together, and although it's the same measurement and same burden at the end, but it more burdens the poor. The gender gap index, we scored 0.64 points, ranking 129 out of 146 countries globally. If we look at the healthcare access, which is highly stratified by wealth and geography, we will find that there are great inequities, especially to villages and hamlets, where the healthcare is really minimal, and we have widened education disparities, which means now that we don't want to have this inheritance this inequality to be inherited through generations. There is a geographic multidimensional poverty, not only through rural and urban areas, but also for Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Disability was amongst the poorest. 20% of the population mounts up to 18% out of them are suffering from poverty, and food security threatens 23% of them versus 13% for people with no disabilities, and of course, literacy as well. So let us have a look at, in spite of all the policies that are taking place to expand social protection, poverty is growing, whether for not only for local and national reasons, but for regional reasons and for global reasons. So we will find that the situation is becoming intricate to social policy. We currently measure poverty not as a monetary poverty, but as a multidimensional poverty, and that's why we're speaking about equity or inequity in all of these factors. It's not only about income, about education, whether the school attendance or years of schooling, child mortality, nutrition, about energy, about water, about electricity, and about asset ownership. So when we calculate the equality or the poverty, we calculate all of these factors, and this is why we call for a multidimensional approach for measuring inequality. 10 factors contributing to inequality in Egypt. I'll run through them. The first one is economic reforms. We have a VAT that started to be applied in 2016. We have eroded purchasing power, especially for food, and increased living cost. The currency devaluation, we also are suffering from the currency devaluation. It's not only the poor, but the poor are mostly affected by it because it negatively affected real wages and the cost of living. And eventually, it exacerbated inequality. Long-term agricultural and inequality, the land holdings and currently the real estate after the massive investment housing, we will find that those who have capital are more investing into this and the vice versa. So in spite of all the government, what's the government doing? There is some sort of social protection is not a reaction to economy. It's a part and parcel actually of the economy itself. And remittances have substantially dropped, and labor force participation. There's a mismatch between education and labor market, especially when we think of technology, AI, and digitalization. The GDP growth score is higher, but without job creation. Female labor participation, as I said, is low. And the population size, although it slowed down, but nonetheless, I mean, the exponential factor of the population size that we currently have is burdening the economy and the social and cultural norms. And I think one of the main issues that we forgot to mention in the opening remarks, that we should consider culture and environment in measuring inequality, because I think culture is part of it. Speaking about violence against women, about the perceptions and about the culture, it largely affects the inequality. Let's speak about the government or the role of social policies, that it actually improves the income security and poverty reduction. It helps on the rotation of capital and on consumption trade, job creation, investment in human capital is the most important of it, and social and political mobility, structural transformation of the economy. Let's speak about the government strategy in terms of towards how inequality or equity has to be enhanced. Human rights-based approach, now it's not a Western approach or culture, now it's now entrenched into the Constitution and on everything related to social policies. Geographic targeting, we moved from universal targeting to geographic targeting and to targeting at large, geographic, gender, age. It's combined with other sources of health and education and development services and combined on SDGs. Now we have mapping of the poor through the poverty maps produced by CAPMAS. There is a unified national registry by the ID number. And now the budget, there is a budget in the state for the social protection and anti-corruption measures. Now if we look at the social protection budget trend, we will find that it's growing more and more. Actually, it started with 110 billion in 2010, and now it's 635 billion, which means it's compared to 2010, it's increased 480 times if we measure it compared to 2000, it's increased 1,500 times. So it's not a matter of the budget only, but also of the policies. Our target audience are the person who is not necessarily suffering from any sort of other ones. It could be, as I said, a person who have wealth or income, but still suffering from inequity, lowest quintile, children, especially those who are deprived of care, people with disabilities, women, casual labor, elderly, and those who are hit by shocks or pandemics. We actually adopted several approaches in order to invest in social protection, health insurance, cash transfer, which is popular, Takaful and Karama, economic empowerment programs, early childhood development, social housing, social insurance, food subsidy, and service development, which is the popular Hayat Karima. So it's an integrated approach, that the holistic approach that includes and actually addresses different sorts of inequalities. Here is Takaful and Karama, which is applied for all. We invested a large number of budget. We moved from only 1.7 million households benefiting up to nearly 5 million, which is around 22 million individuals benefiting from cash transfer. The budget increased in 10 years from 3.4 billion to 41 billion. So if the government is serious, yes, but it's not only the Ministry of Social Solidarity, it's different players. We had a geographic targeting. Our main focus is in Upper Egypt because it is the poorest. So it's tailored program according to addressing the different types of inequality in order to invest in human capital. We have programs for children, especially health, nutrition, education, parenting. And that's why if you look at the target audience, you will find that it's a young program that is actually more than around 55% is people under 24 years. So it's investing in age also, and especially on early childhood development, children under 6. And all of those who are benefiting from the cash transfer benefit also from health insurance, exemption of school fees, food ration cards, disability cards, reproductive health services for women, and literacy classes. If we look at the gender, we will find that it's a gender-sensitive program. 77% of the beneficiaries who hold the cards are women. So it's a gender-centered, and it's in a way or another empowering women to take decisions and adding different benefits for women especially. And for the first time that the card is written under the name of the woman, and she has the right, she and not her husband, to disburse the resources. And around people with disabilities, 25% of those who are benefiting have one or multiple disabilities. It's also for the illiteracy. If you look at the illiterate, which is around 45%, it was 62%, and with our interventions, it decreased to 45%. So if we look at those who are benefiting from the cash transfer, most of them, or a big portion of them, is also illiterate. So it's a multiple, integrated, complex, vicious circle of inequality. These are decent housing for most of the vulnerable households. We also have gas connections for the beneficiaries. 1 million individuals have eradicated their illiteracy, so it went down from 62% to 46%. We have a program which is called 2 Are Enough, because in order to have more convincing and more reproductive health services for women, and I'm about to get done, there's a strategy for protection of casual labor, and it's just presented before I left the service, but casual labor was a big issue in the government, not only in terms of social protection, in terms of economic empowerment and protection of shocks. And this is finally the economic empowerment about entrepreneurship, livelihood or asset transfer, vocational training, intensive labor. So there are different windows for people who, not only the casual labor, but in order to get them integrated into the labor market, there is a big reform for social insurance, automating them, increasing the pensions, investing in the sources of the pension money. And finally, there is also relief and compensation for people who suffer from shocks and pandemics, and we all saw the suffering of all nations regarding COVID-19. we're not working, we were not working alone as a government, but we also have around 34,000 NGOs that we're supporting. And before I just leave, because it's not only about the government budget, there is also a budget that is not reported, whether through religious institutions or through households who are paying lots of effort in terms of solidarity. And that's why if you calculate it by numbers, especially the Egyptian society, is a bit complicated. You have to consider the culture, because during the month of Ramadan and during different occasions, you will find that everybody is helping, and that's why I return again to Mary. It's not only about emotions, but about social responsibility. We dream of equitable development and social justice. It's something relevant and intrinsic to humanity. So we will keep going. It's how much investment we're putting in, and we hope all the best for all those who are suffering, not to suffer in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nivin. This was a really insightful presentation, giving us a lot on the details and on the past period, what has been happening in Egypt. And I could see the students busily typing. We have a lot of our students in the audience, continuing the legacy of Dr. Laila with the bonus assignment to take notes during the panel. So our next speaker is Dr. Yijia Jing. He is the Changjiang Scholar, Seeker Chan Chair Professor in Public Management, Dean of the Institute of Global Public Policy. He's also the co-director of the LSE London School of Economics Fudan Research Center for Global Public Policy, and the director of the Fudan Arab Research Center for Global Development and Governance at Fudan University in Shanghai in China. He conducts research on privatization, governance, social organizations, and collaborative service delivery, and published in many of the top journals, of course, Public Administration Review, Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, and others. But he also currently serves as Vice President of the International Research Society for Public Management, and is the founding president of the China Arab Network of Schools of Public Policy and Administration, which also GAPP is a part of. And he'll be speaking on governing a big country is like cooking small fish, exploring China's governance of mega provinces.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I want to thank Professor Shahjahan and Professor Loha for inviting me here. And 2 years ago in 2023, it's my first time to visit your beautiful campus. In 2023, it's my first time to visit your beautiful campus. I think at that time, Professor Loha, the Dean, and also Professor Laila, they received me. After that, the collaboration between the two schools developed really fast. But today, it's unfortunate that both of them are not here. So I hope Professor Loha will quickly and fully recover from her illness. And also, I hope peace will always be with Laila in heaven. Today, I will share with my recent research that's still ongoing, and it is to be polished further. It's about the governing of local jurisdictions, and especially in China. Today, we see the rise of mega states. For example, my friend R. Roberts, he recently wrote a book about super states. So he treats US, China, India, and the EU as 4 super states. Along with the rise of super states, we also see the rise of super local jurisdictions at the provincial, municipal, township, and even lower levels. Okay, because of many reasons. For example, because of local mergers, because of decentralization reform, or economic boom, or population growth and migration. So these local jurisdictions, they outform the counterparts in many aspects. For example, we see population or economic size. So my study is a kind of combination of intergovernmental relation in public administration as well as China studies. Because my idea is that if the central government just makes use of the general intergovernment framework to govern this kind of rise of MEG local jurisdictions, that may not be enough. So the national governments, they often employ specific and diversified strategies to manage these huge local jurisdictions. But in doing that, there is a difficulty because for the the MEG local jurisdictions, for example, Guangdong province in China, California state in the US, Tokyo in Japan, or Seoul in South Korea, they represent national competence. Okay. But at the same time, they have very strong absorbing effects that creates a lot of inequality among the local jurisdictions, that creates unbalanced development, including the reduced social quality among the different jurisdictions. So for the intervention of the central government, it has to balance, it has to reconcile these two goals, okay, national competence and balanced development. The literature in this regard is not so developed. And actually in different contexts, the way to introduce that kind of balanced goals can be different. So I will look at China, because we know that since 1978, since China began its reform and opening up, China became the second largest economic entity of the world. And along with that, we had MEG provinces, or we also have MEG municipalities, MEG towns, MEG counties. Okay. So how did China govern the rise of MEG provinces or MEG local jurisdictions? I cite a statement by Taoism. It's from the classic of Taoism, Dao De Jing. It says that governing a big country is like cooking small fish, because small fish is very tender. In the cooking process, for any intervention of the chef, it has to be cautious, careful, thoughtful. So different goals can be reconciled. So I use the word delicate governance to describe this kind of way of governance. I will get back to this. First, we look at the context of MEG local jurisdiction governance in China. Since China's reform and opening up in 1978, we see that there's a kind of rise of MEG provinces. We just look at the provincial level. For example, if we look at the economic size and population size, in 2021, the GDP of Guangdong province was already more than the GDP of Australia. And in the next year, the GDP of Guangdong province exceeded that of South Korea. And actually some other provinces of China, like Jiangsu and Shandong province, they are also very huge. Okay. If we look at the change of these MEG provinces since 1978 in 3 stages, we will see it's stable, but it's always evolving and changing. So that shows a competition among these provinces. And we see a kind of systematic favor of the coastal provinces of China, like Guangdong, Shandong, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, because they benefit most from globalization and marketization. You see, for example, since 1978, Guangdong basically it takes over the top positions in terms of top 5. Okay, Liaoning province was once the strongest before 1978 during the planned economy, but it declined, significantly. So how did the Chinese government, the central government, govern the MEG provinces? So first, this has to be located in the general evolution of central-local relation in China. We see since 1978, there are 3 stages. First, that's intensive decentralization to meet the purpose to get involved in the global economic system. So both economic and politically, there was decentralization. Then since 1993, for 2 decades, there was kind of selective centralization stage, because that kind of negative effects of decentralization appeared, and the central government had to intervene, especially by making use of the tax assignment reform in 1993. And then in recent decade, we call it a kind of centralization stage. So both economically and politically, there was comprehensive centralization by the central government. Then we introduced the framework of MLG, mega local jurisdiction governance, the delegate governance. So the basic idea is that for China, it's a unitary system. Then the governance of local jurisdictions, of course, is still kind of interactive process. Of course, there is gaming, but fundamentally, it's a responsibility of the central government. And that means to respond to the rise of mega provinces, then the central government has to recognize the real status of these mega provinces, the real demands of these mega provinces, but come up with equivalent control over them to reach a kind of balance. So it basically the two principles. One is to give more discretion to the mega provinces, but at the same time, more control. They match each other in a kind of dynamic way. And that also means that kind of governance system doesn't just rely on formal institutions. Informal institutions actually play a much bigger role than we expect, especially in the political sector governance. So that leads to 4 propositions. For the first 2 propositions, it just means for the single sector of governance, for the economic sector governance and for the political sector governance, there shall be a kind of balancing. To give more economic freedom of discretion to the provinces, at the same time, more economic control. And for the political sector, it's still true. More political power, political discretion to the mega provinces, but also more political control. And for proposition 3, that means cross-sector balance, more economic discretion, as well as more political control to balance political governance and economic governance. The last proposition is that, the rules of balancing, economic rules or political rules, they shall also be balanced in some way. So we do some empirical analysis. First, we look at the balancing of economic issues. We use mixed methods. We combine t-test and regression. And to measure the economic discretion as well as control, we use 6 widely used indicators. These are the fiscal capacity per capita, fiscal autonomy, marketization index, free trade zone, transfer share, and also remittance share of the provinces. And we do t-tests. Basically, we have 3 groups. The first group is mega provinces. The second group is municipalities directly supervised by the central government. We have 4 of them. These are still provinces, but they are cities, like Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, and Chongqing. So they are very special. And then the other 22 provinces. The t-test shows that basically for the mega provinces, they have higher degree of economic discretion in many aspects. But at the same time, these mega provinces, they have to submit higher proportion of the revenues to the central government. So they face more economic control from above. So here are the results of t-test. It's quite messy, so let's just skip this. And then we also do the regression. We use these 6 indicators as the dependent variables. And the independent variables are actually 3 groups. The mega provinces, the municipalities directly supervised by the central government, and other provinces. And here we use the economic size to measure the megalith economic size. But we also use population and some other indicators. Actually, the results are quite consistent. And so we do the regression in the 3 stages. Just now I said that, decentralization, selective centralization, and centralization. So regressions in these 3 stages, so still we skip this table of results. And brief summary is that I think basically for the 3 stages, according to the regression results for the mega provinces as well as the municipalities directly supervised by the central governments, they have more economic discretion, economic authority, and freedom. But they have to submit relatively more, compared to other provinces, to the central government. So that's kind of balance of rights and obligation. Okay. The only change in the pattern is that in the third stage, for the municipalities directly supervised by the central government, like Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Chongqing, they no longer submit relatively more compared to other regular provinces. But for the mega provinces, still, they submit more to the central government. Then we look at political governance. Because we look at Chinese economic bureaucracy, it has its political foundation. That political foundation is about many things, but now since we look at central-local relation, basically we look at the power of the central government to promote and discipline the provincial leaders, including the provincial party secretaries and also the provincial governors. So we look at 10 most important indicators. These are also widely used. Yeah, one is the Politburo membership. For the Central Party Committee, it has a Politburo composed of about 24, 25 members. These are the most important politicians in China. So for the members within this Politburo, do they assume the provincial party secretary position at the same time? Okay, of course, if they assume that, that means for that province, it has more political powers. But it also has to demonstrate more political loyalty to a central government. It has to discipline itself more politically. Okay. And promotion to the Politburo. So in certain years, so is or was the party secretary of the province promoted to the Politburo? Okay, that also shows the status of that province. But to get that kind of promotion, of course, these provinces have to actively demonstrate the loyalty to a central government. So it's both about power and control. And for the next two indicators, local secretary and local governor just measures if the party secretaries and the provincial governors are from inside. Are they promoted from inside, or actually they are appointed by central government from outside? Maybe a person from central government or a person from another province is assigned to these positions. So if a person, a kind of outsider is appointed to these positions, that means more central control. That's a way to fight localism. Okay, if a person is promoted from inside, of course, it's more likely that he or she will be more identified with the local interests. Okay. Still, we do t-test and we do logistic regression. Okay. And so first we do the t-test along the 3 stages of China's central-local relation. We find that for the first stage and before the early 1990s, basically for the mega provinces, the chance to be promoted into the Politburo, or for the Politburo to be, members to assume the local leadership positions, is not significantly higher. But the higher chance is that local people are more likely to be promoted to the provincial party secretary or provincial governor positions. So that means the local governments of these provinces, of mega provinces, they have better chance to make good decisions for local economic development. If people are promoted from inside, they know better about the local conditions. They can make better local development policies. And in the second stage, we see that due to the selective centralization, so for the mega provinces, they have higher chance to have their top leaders to promote it into the Politburo, and also the high likelihood for the Politburo member to assume the party leadership in the provinces at the same time, in the mega province at the same time. Okay, but in the second stage, that kind of anti-localism makes it equally unlikely for insiders to be promoted into the local party or local governor positions. And that pattern continues in the third stage. So these are the t-test results. And then we do a kind of logistic regression using these 4 indicators as dependent variables. And basically, the results are quite consistent. You know, we do a regression along all the years from 1978 to 2021. So basically, it shows for mega provinces, they do have more likelihood to, get promoted into the Politburo and to have that concurrent appointment. But the likelihood to have low insiders to rise to the leadership positions are equally low, because that's already kind of national rule to fight localism. Okay, and we also see a kind of balancing between economic and political governance. We don't do quantitative analysis for this point, but we see from our previous data analysis, okay, for mega provinces, continuously they are having more economic freedom, and continuously they are facing more political control from above. And also based on existing literature, okay, we show there is a trend of regionally decentralized authoritarian system that combine political centralization and regional economic decentralization. And next is about the rules. The rules. We see in general since 1978 there's kind of formalization of the governing system of China both in economic and political sectors. But to better involve in global economy, we see the economic rules are getting more and more predictable, rational, transparent. Okay, so we have to follow global rules to develop our economy. But for the political sector, still it's less transparent. It's quite complicated. For a lot of decisions, we cannot see the exact process. I think there are multiple reasons, because for the Western system, there's a kind of principle to emphasize, competition, two-party or bi-party rule, okay, separation of powers. But for the Chinese political system, competition is not so much emphasized. We see a lot of competition in the economic sector, but in the political sector, the emphasis is the coordination by the Chinese Communist Party, also by the central government. So informal rules sometimes also created kind of reliable prediction, and it also reserves quite a lot of flexibility to the party and to the central government. So I think our conclusion is quite straightforward. So basically, respecting the different demands and situations of the mega provinces to give them more freedom in different sectors, across the sectors, to create kind of balance, I think, and to make use of both formal and informal rules. So that's a way of the, delicate governance of China. Okay. But I think for different contexts, of course, the way to realize delicate governance may be different. So it quite depends on our culture, our governance tradition, the people's trust over government. Okay. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. Thank you very much, Professor. This was fascinating. We have run over a little bit over time. It's all my fault. I'm never the right person for time management. But we will have our last speaker, Dr. Sean McCandless. So Dr. Sean is an associate professor of public and nonprofit management at the University of Texas at Dallas. He is, of course, a well-known scholar in the areas of human resource management, organizational dynamics, and theory, psychology of and at work, emotional labor, life and work satisfaction and meaning. He is an associate editor of Public Administration Review, Public Administration Review of Public Personnel Administration, and also the new journal, the Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration. And this is Sean's second year here at GAPP, so we're very grateful for him coming back. And his talk is helping us to think through comparatively across the different contexts that we've been looking at, so operationalizing equity and looking at different contexts. Thank you.
Shukran, shukran. So I have to take the microphone out. When I was younger, I used to be a footballer, when I was younger and more athletic, so I have to move around. I'll be channeling Mohamed Salah, one of my favorite football players. But I'd be remiss if I didn't start my comments without addressing the legacy of Dr. Layla. You know, last year when I was here, I had the honor of sitting next to Dr. Layla at dinner, and also Marwa. And as I was reveling over the wonder of Egyptian cuisine, koshari, and Dr. Layla was telling me about the proper way to eat it, she saw how enthusiastic I was about the cuisine. And she was so interested in people and caring for them that the next day she texted our tour to ask to make sure I was enjoying the food. That's the level of care and compassion that she had, even in such a small moment like that. And during the first workshop, she said to me, "I'm looking forward to your presentation." And I said, "Well, Dr. Layla, please send me any good vibes you have." And during our moment of silence, I asked the same thing. So, Dr. Layla, thank you. So, I had called this Comparative Lessons from 10 Governments because these are lessons that I've found across the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and something I'm working on with my colleagues and also is going to be the subject of a book, which is how do we get to the meaning of social equity in practice? What are the patterns across societies and government about how social equity is conceptually defined and how it's operationally defined? And one of the things I was so grateful to hear Their Excellency, the Minister Emerita, talk about the importance of culture. Because we have to ask ourselves, what is the importance of fairness? Because the most common shorthand definition of social equity is fairness. Fairness for all. And the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, really highlighted in a lot of ways the importance of fairness for all. This was a picture that was taken in the US territory of Guam, handing out supplies during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this pandemic really exposed certain disparities about who faces disparities in terms of who's infected, who's hospitalized, or who can't afford to be hospitalized, and also access to vaccines. It reminded us that public administration has an integral role to foster service, fair service for all. Which is why it's so incumbent on us as a field to understand not only what social equity means conceptually, but how it gets translated all the way down to the street level. So, like Mohamed Salah said, you know, I'm in extra time, but sometimes magic can still happen in extra time. So I'm going to give you hopefully 6 pieces of magic that I think are really important there. Because Susan Gooden, the social equity scholar, and someone with whom I wrote a book, asked 5 really important questions. You can read the original chapter of this in a book that Dr. Mary Guy co-edited with Dr. Marilyn Rubin, in which Dr. Gooden says that there's 5 big social equity questions that we have to attend to. Who counts as we? Now, this obviously borrows from American jurisprudence because our Constitution opens with the line, "We the people," which when it was crafted in 1787, as Dr. Mary Guy pointed out, was really white property opening men. This expanded over the centuries, and it gets to this question of what is the extent of inequities, why do inequities persist, and how is accountability for social equity achieved? How do we make sure that agencies are actually fostering social equity? These are questions that anyone in public administration has to ask. Because social equity consists of 4 major dimensions of access, which I represent here in a very quintessential picture of the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles in the United States, but I know that there's equivalent of these types of administrative encounters all over the world. Processes, which is symbolized by a police stop. Quality, by dirty water. And of course, if you put in Google, what are happy outcomes? Believe it or not, that's the look that comes up. That ideally we want people to be happy and well cared after and standing up and smiling. And this matters for public administration as well because, well, we're supposed to be a science. We're also an art. And the scientist and philosopher of science, Henri Poincaré, talked about the importance of going beyond facts, but having facts really speak to how and why something works the way that it does. So we have to understand how and why social equity does or does not work the way that it does or should or we want to, if we have any hope of wanting to improve it. And as Dr. Norman Rakucci said, well, maybe our field, we can't get to perfect classical science. Maybe we can't achieve a pure objectivity. We're a post-normal science. Yeah, maybe we can't achieve objectivity, but we can still really go a long way in understanding how and why something works the way that it does. And as our wonderful colleague, Dr. Leila, sagaciously put it, this quotation jumped off the page, and I said this had to go there. It matters very importantly for education, because ethics and social equity are linked. Social equity is a dimension of public service ethics. And as Dr. Leila said, in some contexts, talking about ethics in government or the lack of it, they perceive as a sensitive and troublesome issue. Sometimes students are not sufficiently interested, especially when they witness the chasm between what should be and what is happening in reality. So we're talking about values, we're talking about interests, and we're talking about them nested, and it matters for everything that we do. Dr. Leila said so, and she's right. So throughout this, I want you to keep in mind a couple of key questions. What does social equity mean? Who defines the meaning of social equity? And how do definitions get translated into practice? So, lesson number one of the 6. Social equity is nested at multiple levels. Something that was woven throughout all of the presentation here was the importance of context, the importance of culture, the importance of history. But also that social equity is a value, a guiding value of saying we want to foster fairness for all. And of course, it exists at multiple levels. We have all the way at the societal values, which translate into what gets written in the law, constitutional legal values, what then gets written in terms of what political institutions and administrators do, all the way down to how this is enacted at the street level. And all of them have the importance of social equity throughout them, but they all go back to values that co-influence one another. And yes, there is discussion across cultures that there are sources for these values. Transcendental sources are sometimes proposed, that is from a deity. Nature, this is the way the universe works, or some sort of combination of biology, psychology, and sociology. But regardless of the source in society, values exhibit social constructions. That is, my beliefs about myself, my beliefs about you, and vice versa, and those interactions create the world of meaning around us. And these create discourses, long-standing debates over meaning, and these discourses of who matters drive social equity. And that's the key question about social equity, who matters? And in a book that I did with Dr. Sabharwal, who was here last year, and Dr. Viswanath, we propose that these discourses, which ultimately come down to who's deserving, who exhibits privilege, what position should you have, what biases are evident in society, are contingent upon earlier dimensions of markets, legal, political, managerial dimensions, which are then nested within history, culture, and economy. And these power and existing structures matter enormously, because I can say to you, fairness means fairness for all. And someone could turn right around and say, well, I'm in power. What it means to me is this, and you're going to live with it. I'm still trying to define social equity, but the power and positionality of who is doing the defining, whose definitions become law, matter enormously. Because a population that has been historically marginalized will maybe have certain definitions of equity, and someone who is in power who may not have the interests of that society will have a completely different definition. And those differences in definitions that become enacted in actual practice. So a common thread, social equity at its core about who matters means that some identity has value, is worthy, it deserves recognition, and it deserves legal protection. This matters because when we see these divergences in social equity and the meaning of social equity across different groups, across different societies, across different issues, this is always at play. In which very often what happens if someone would say this group does not have value, is not worthy, does not deserve this recognition or this protection, it comes down to that discourse there. And some of these discourses we can really visualize. Discourses have artifacts in them. And I took a few different examples. This was something that was very popularly shared among the Hispanic communities in the United States. So this, when translated to English, "Mi sueño, mi tragedia," means same dream, same tragedy. And what this depicts is Aylan Kurdi, who was a child fleeing the violence in Syria who drowned in the Mediterranean. And also Daralira Martinez, who with her father crossing the Rio Grande in the United States, drowned. And this was an example of a discourse saying, same dream, same tragedy. These identities, these people have value, and systems need to be put into place to protect them. It's a manifestation of a discourse. These lives matter. Quite literally, also in the United States, Black Lives Matter. Literally, the name is in the title. This identity matters. It should be protected. For gender equality, but also something that I took in France, that's actually one of my own, when I was in the metro. It's a government ad talking about employment discrimination. The difference between vous commencez lundi, you begin Monday, and vous n'avez pas le profil, you don't have what we're looking for. Talking about this division of who in this French society traditionally considered worthy and unworthy, and who gets the protection of the law and who doesn't. Discourse is visualized, as well as LGBTQ equity, in this instance, in South America. And so this leads to the third lesson of the 6 that I have found. We see how history and context and culture matter. These create discourses of who matters. But these conceptual social constructions become operationalized within agencies themselves. It's within these agencies of people, culture, management, leadership, and capacity that then create these outputs and outcomes, feedback, but exist within a broader system of budgets and expectations and the environment of history, socioeconomic structures, and landscapes. But we're particularly interested in what happens within those agencies to define the meaning of social equity. So I'm going to give you an extended example. Keep these 3 questions in mind. We're going to go through some data here really quickly. Ask to yourself, do the data point to differences or disparities? That's a big difference, isn't it? A difference is just a difference. A disparity has a much more fundamental meaning. Yeah, exactly. What does fairness mean in these circumstances? And how do definitions get translated into practice? So these are data, I took this from the BBC, about fatal police shootings and population size by ethnic group in the United States. A very large issue in the United States in particular. We had a Black Lives Matter movement. We had protests after George Floyd was murdered by police. And what this begins to show is, of course, the population proportion in blue and killed in police shootings. And what it immediately shows is a disparity, particularly for African Americans, in which the disparity, killed in police shooting, is higher than proportions in the society. Difference or disparity? Just think about that. It's an important question. This, also taken from the proceedings in the National Academy of Science in 2019, talking about the lifetime risk of being killed by police per 100,000. And we see, again, disproportionately borne not only by African Americans, but African American men. Then by American Indians, a term that fortunately is becoming less used, unfortunately. Also Latinx, and then down at the bottom, white and less so Asian Pacific Islander. Okay, differences or disparities? One more. Also taken from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. We see here, this is now by age, the greatest disproportionalities or differences or disparities, African American men between the ages of 20 and 40 in particular, but also Latinx, American Indians, so forth, and other populations. Differences or disparities? Getting tired of that question yet? Because it's a very key question. Because one of the things that I have found from studying governments all over the world is that you can have, oopsie doodle, I'm getting so excited, I'm knocking my glasses off. That's all right, there we go. It's okay, Mohamed Salah once lost his shoe when he was trying to make a penalty kick, so I'm just channeling him, we're good. Regardless of the society, we have this same question. You can have, I'm knocking my glasses off, you can have a piece of data presented to an administrator that seemingly would indicate there is a difference between groups, but it still takes a human being with their values and their biases and their positionalities and their beliefs and their position to interpret the meaning of that data, right? Because I have spoken with public administrators who will look at those very same data and they'll give answers like, no, there's no real differences. Well, there's methodological flaws. I don't have to pay attention to that because the researchers have a bias. So therefore, I'm not going to acknowledge it. Administrators can't say that. That is a social construction. They socially construct for them the meaning of that data to say, this, yes, it may say that, but here's what it really means to me. That power and positionality is important. Some will say, yes, there are differences, but that population's doing something wrong. That's very often used as an excuse. And some will say, yes, these are disparities. What is the difference between saying these are differences or these are disparities? Because there's a big difference when it comes to public administration. If they're differences, oh, it's just natural. Oh, we don't have to care about it. Oh, it's unfortunate, but that's just the way the world works. Whereas if it's a disparity, you have to do something about it. That means that there is some sort of difference between the group that's rooted in bias, prejudice, and discrimination. And that's the key meaning of disparity, a difference rooted in bias, prejudice, and discrimination. And so what does fairness mean get into practice? Those definitions, by especially top-level administrators, get translated into practice. And that the meaning of social equity is co-created by administrators, communities, and a mixture. And how these definitions get translated into practice, depending upon what happens here, you can result in no change, a symbolic change, such as the adoption of a law saying we condemn this, but we're not going to do anything about it, operational changes, or policy and operational changes. So lesson 4 of 6, we still have a couple minutes. Organizations then adopt tactics to define equity in terms of practice. And I'm going to be talking to you about two sides of it, both defining social equity in order to resist it and defining social equity in order to advance it. So let's talk about the resistance part first. Across the societies I have studied, agencies, when they try to resist definitions of equity and get to this hostility, unrepresentatedness, dismissive, marginalization, and stratification, always adopt a few particular strategies of denying equity problems. That can be a strategy that can be adopted by saying, well, we refuse to admit that this is a disparity or a difference, thus we don't have to act. Another tactic that can be used is shifting blame. My agency is not responsible for the issue. Your agency is. That other one is. We don't work with them. We're good. Blaming the community is another strategy. That a community that argues about inequity, well, the problem is that their understanding is wrong. It's not our problem, it's their problem. Reframing problems. Well, equity, you shouldn't understand it this way, it's better understood this other way. Or applying social pressure, pseudo-delegating, or even up to engaging in violence. The two major forms of violence being hierarchical, keeping groups in their proper place, whatever that is, or exclusionary, seeking to eliminate those groups or denying the issues that they face. So lesson 5, here's the positive stuff. Equity champions make all the difference through advocacy and the development of specific tools. One of the things I was so happy to hear across these examples, especially by Her Excellency the Minister Emerita, were these specific tools that were developed. And this always happens in the establishment of successful development of social equity. Social equity requires what my colleague and I, Brandy Blessed, call social equity entrepreneurs. You're probably learning in your policy process class, there's policy entrepreneurs, people who try to advocate for a particular policy. But social equity entrepreneurs are those who say, we are going to take social equity seriously and adopt these particular policies. They matter. But they matter through the development also of specific tools. Here is an example of a racial equity toolkit from King County, Washington, where Seattle is. And you notice how sometimes very specific the use of this tool is, where you have to set outcomes, and governments are required within King County to do that. Involve stakeholders, all the way back to reporting to communities. Within a budgetary tool, about review and recommendations, performance offer, evaluation of trade-offs. Anyone involved in the budget process should be familiar with these tools, the creation of actual tools to foster equity. Not just advocacy, but specific tools. Here's more examples from this worksheet. You can see how specific this tool is and the multiple layers of accountability therein. Lesson 506, I'm almost done. Equity champions make all the difference through advocacy, but also the development of specific tools. As we see through the example of something like budgeting, individual leaders make all the difference, especially through outreach. There is no better social equity tool than outreach to populations who have historically been left out of discussions. And when public administration is able to address those disparities in access of who can participate, whose voice is heard, then that tends to be where a lot of these policies about social equity become to get adopted. And just wrapping up here, public service education advances equity adoption. So I'm so happy that we have so many people here from AUC. We have a few deans as well. We have empirical evidence that public service education actually does influence equity adoption, which means the more likely you are to have something like an MPA, a public administration degree like the ones you get here, the more likely you are to take social equity seriously. And here's a little bit of empirical evidence for this. My colleagues and I, and this is specific to North Carolina, one US state, but it's bearing out across some other places we're looking at. We're doing a study in which we collected data from 100 counties in North Carolina about the innovation and diffusion of social equity budgeting practices. And there's a lot of wonderful things here about the panel-loged approach that we use, a lot of wonderful results there. But one thing in particular stands out. MPA education makes a difference. The more you are educated in public service, the more likely you are to be an equity champion within government. And so just wrapping up here, what are some of these big lessons? We have these discourses, these overarching conversations about equity that are contingent upon organizational power and positionality, that result in approaches to equity, and that finally get to equity definitions in practice. It goes from these discourses all about deservingness and worthiness, down to these different ways we discuss. Is this a difference or disparity? Are we going to be a champion or a resistor? Are we going to have inertia or buy-in? Are we going to promote public service education? These equity approaches result about, are we going to define equity this way or this other way? And finally, to the development of specific tools and promoting parity and access, quality, processes, and outcomes. And so these are 6 very big lessons that I have seen across societies about the meaning of how social equity goes from a broad discourse all the way down to street-level practice. But it all is contingent upon these definitions of who matters, who is there, who is making the decision, the beliefs and positionalities of those making the decision, who is at the table, who is not at the table, but also your public service values and the education you receive at institutions like this one. So there we go. I only managed to knock my glasses off once, and my shoe didn't even fall off. So thank you, Dr. Leila. Thank you, Mohammed Salah, for the inspiration. And we're done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sean. I think this is a great bringing back to GAPP and to all of our public service programs, really thinking about how we can become social equity entrepreneurs and what that means and how this can be defined in different contexts. We will open the floor for a quick Q&A and then maybe hear some final closing remarks at the end. So if we'll do a round of questions, take multiple questions, and then hand it back to the panel. So we have Dr. Ali first. If we have a mic that's going around.
Okay. Now, you did not answer the question, is policy pro-equity or not? I can give you hundreds of examples. I mean, in the US, for example, we talk about Amendment 13. What does that mean? you're abolishing slavery, but then you're saying you can actually enforce slavery based on the punishment of law. Brilliant. And then this would explain why do you have disproportionate blacks in jail, because you're enslaving them. That's one. The other thing is the issue of taxation. The famous Ken Galbraith told Teddy Roosevelt that you should have a wealth tax. It is only natural that you should have progressive taxes on the wealthy. Now, this disappeared completely, right? As if, and you're relying on the goodwill of the rich. Now, the other thing, I mean, I might address Hadratik. When we talk, for example, in Egypt, there is a tremendous amount of hidden modern-day slavery. And by the way, it's across the board. When you talked about regional, the zip code in the US is a determinant of the longevity, the health, the earning, the education. That's everywhere in the world. And it is structural. Now, when you talk about domestic workers, شغالات اللي في البيوت, we all have them. How many of us actually pay social security for them? I know most of us would help them for a long duration, but that's not charity, that's their right. And I have never seen anybody come up and say, "Ya Jama'a, we should have social security for those guys." I mean, there are many, many, many other things that I don't want to sort of monopolize, but thank you for a very interesting workshop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. We have Kareem at the back. Thank you, Mohammed.
I'm sorry, this is how excited I am. Yes, I'll keep my glasses on. A few days ago, I attended a public talk on the discussion of the newly enacted Egyptian labor law at AUC Tahrir. And one of the criticisms of the parliamentarians on the panel was that there wasn't a proper there wasn't a proper social discourse or an inclusive dialogue, an inclusive social dialogue. The government's representative defended this by, from what I understood is that, from what he said, I understood that they followed some sort of stratified sampling for the different unions, okay? So sometimes inclusivity or equity is practically impossible. Is there a solution, or is it just something we have to accept as a reality of life?
Great, thank you so much, Kareem, one of our students. Other questions? Yes, Dr. Reda, yes, of course, a PPAD.
Thank you all. This has been a very rich meal. I truly appreciate the diversity of interventions and where we're coming from, East and West and US, Mesopotamia and Babel and going back in history. It's just an amazing trip. I'm an annoying methodologist. So I have a question for you. When you say people with public administration training have more propensity to have social service, I worry about selection bias. You go to public admin when you have. So I just, you know, as a methodologist who's very annoying, I just wanted to discuss this. But I want to thank all the panelists for such an, and I'm a methodologist too. Are you working with 5 observations? All the analysis is with 5 observations? So these are my questions, and I know it's, you know, these nitty-gritty questions that are, and again,
great.
It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reda. We have Professor Ibrahim as well.
Thank you very much for all the presentations, extremely interesting. I have a question to you and a question to you. You talked about construction of this course. To which extent are policies guided by constructed discourse? And to which extent are they guided by facts, by evidence? Is evidence really what drives policy making, or is it more of the discourse that you construct? This is my question. To you, I come from a background in the United Nations, and in the organization where I was, China, so powerful economically, and yet would ask for a small grant to implement a pilot project. And if it is successful, China takes it upon itself from its resources to implement it all over China. It's fantastic. How do you do that? How does it work? So you have a pilot project implemented in a city in China, and then it is reproduced all over China. How do you do that? It is really a riddle. How are you successful in doing that? How does it work? How does public administration work there?
Thank you, Professor Ibrahim. Last comments, Dr. Marwan.
I echo Dr. Gheda. It's such a rich meal. It's really amazing having you guys present us so much diverse experiences and learning. So it's been really a pleasure listening to all of you. My question is for everyone on the panel. In this world, like speaking about equity, especially equity and values, in this changing world now that we're living in, where values are twisted and where we no longer understand what's going on, how public policy can really do something in such a rapidly changing environment that we're living in, where values are really upside down and materialism are taking over and democracy is vanishing, and there's so much going on now that we really need to stick to our values and traditions and this accumulative. I enjoyed from Texas, Dr. Sean, about this values and how this is really not something that is accumulative over communities, and that this is accumulative learning that we reached in our civilizations, and all of a sudden we're faced with a complete diversity in how people see things and how superpowers see things. So how are you as professors and civil workers and public policy gurus see the role of public policy in keeping us safe from this insanity around us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marwa. I think that's a very pressing question on all of our minds. I think we'll go in order of the panel. So maybe Dr. Jos, whichever question spoke to you the most, and maybe some closing remarks. You are on mute.
I was thinking about the comment. I think one of the first comments that was made about whether we should accept inequities. I mentioned on purpose in the beginning of my presentation that generally it is believed by anthropologists that in prehistory people were very egalitarian. Once we start living a sedentary life and reach population sizes where we no longer know one another, it is unavoidable that social stratification will emerge. Yeah? So I think social stratification and inequity is a fact of life. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept egregious inequities, such as just check Facebook, and there is this one post that says that 8 people own more than 4 billion other people on the globe. That is inequity. And we can do something along the lines of what Hubert Humphrey said, and it was not a quote from him. I'm not sure how old the quote is, but it resonates with me when I think of the ancient Egyptian texts that I have at home. That is, the moral test of government is how it treats those at the dawn of life, the children, how it treats those in the dusk of life, the elderly, and how it treats those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. That is to say, what Antonio Serra wrote about as in good government, taking care of people means that those who have the ability to take care of others should do so. And if it's not voluntarily, and the comment that was made about reliance upon charity is especially pertinent in the United States, if it's not voluntarily, we have to simply, redistribute some of the wealth via progressive taxation. And that I have seen that image, the difference between equality and equity. Through legislation, we can improve equity, but we can never get to a completely egalitarian society. I don't think that's possible.
Thank you very much for the reality check, I think as well. Mary?
I would like for us all to go to school on what Joseph just said. There's nothing new about social equity. This is not a new idea. This is as old as human beings are old. And it just is.
Yeah.
The challenge is how to operationalize it, and how to be responsive to the times and the attitudes and the values. But I want to go specifically to your question. When everything is changing around us, when it's everything all the time, everywhere, what do we do? This is where I find the imperatives of public administration to be so incredibly helpful. The economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. Those four values. Now, the rub comes in that you cannot maximize all four of those at the same time. So you have to make a trade-off. And then you have to have the courage to own your decision and your own values when you decide whether you're going to trade off equity for efficiency. I mean, that's where it becomes very much of an individual moral choice, and it gets down to the humanness of it, to who you are as a person, what you stand for, what you're willing to stand up for. But those four imperatives I find to be, those are anchors that are very helpful.
Thank you. Minister Nivin.
Thank you very much, and I praise all the presentations that were done. I really benefited from them. I'll answer the specific question about the casual labor and then go to the issue of inequality at large. And I'll just give example of we have around 10 to 12 million individuals who are working under as casual labor. So they are not protected at all, which constitutes around 60%, and it will even increase because social insurance contribution is becoming a bit larger and higher for the casual labor to formalize themselves. And then you go into a vicious circle of, as soon as they formalize themselves, they are being asked to pay taxes and to pay lots of costs that are not calculated. It's a big gap that social protection is being taken as a response to economic reform and to reaction, and not as an intrinsic part of the economy. It's not a pressure, it's not a burden. On the contrary, it should be more productive, and we can use it even for the benefit of it. So, for example, removing the subsidy of the milk formula from children will actually get people into more of informality. This is one, and the other thing is that speaking about if it is accepted or not about inequality, it started with humanity a long time ago, and it was all in our religious commandments, whether the different religions, about equity. So it's not only a personal choice, it's a value, and I agree with you, it's about having it as a value even before coming as a discourse and ideology. So I think having it as an ideology is not a personal choice, because everyone, it's the world of interests, and we're living in a world of realism. So people are trying to get the best interests and most of what they can have, not necessarily of thinking of others, because we're living in a realistic world. Definitely there are people who have their ideologies, but it depends on the systems and the laws that are there to protect them, and about also the knowledge of these people that they have these rights to ask about. So it will continue, and it might even get harder with lack of jobs during the coming period, with the economic situation all over the world, but it does never mean that we accept, because it's the constant and continuous drought of not only advocacy at the level of discourse, but down to practice. Because as much as these people are asking court and they found advocates for the people who cannot speak for themselves, we can find this. And I was working in the government, and I was working in the non-governmental organizations or UN system. It's all about at the same level. You will not find that the world is totally different, but that's why it has to be put as a system, but people need to know more about it. And you will always find advocates, whether they are agents of change, or champions of change, natural leaders, but you will always find scholars, academics, and practitioners who are promoting this. So it does not mean that we're going into an ideal world. Yes, we're aware that it's tough, but in the midst of the way, we should not stop. That's why I think accepting it is, on the contrary, we should put people accountable for it. I like the issue of centralization and decentralization, because in Egypt we've been suffering out of this bouncing between centralization and decentralization, but I think China model is good. And by the way, China and India, I was just telling Mary that they are two examples, good practices of countries that moved out of poverty in a very short period of time, and they jumped from total poverty that is getting above 80% to less than 20%. And this is because they invested in human capital. Investing in human capital is more equity for people who are deprived of the tools for being invested in them. So thank you, and thank you, Professor, for inviting me, and for Dr. Noam Mekkawi, and of course for all the team, Noura and the others. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Yijia.
Thank you very much for the very excellent questions. First, that's about methodology. I don't just look at 5 examples or 5 observations. Actually, for our research, we use the panel data, so we have the information of all the provinces in all the years. But how to define mega provinces? Basically, we use the top 5 provinces in terms of GDP of that year. So that's a way to measure megaliths. You know. And for your question, that's great. That's about the policy experiment in China. So how can we, create and disseminate policies? I think at the starting point in 1978, of course, we had a socialist planned economy. We had a very closed society. So to introduce anything new, especially if learned from the West, that can be very difficult. So we took a strategy of gradual reform, or they can call it piecemeal reform or step-by-step reform. Or in Chinese words, we say we cross a river by touching the stone. So we made a lot of experiments, but how can the experiments be successful? Yeah, so I think basically there are different mechanisms. For example, we look at intergovernmental relation. Sometimes the local governments, they wanted to innovate. And sometimes the higher level governments or the central governments will assign the innovation or the innovative policy to be first tried somewhere, for example, in Shanghai, in the most appropriate place with the best conditions to get success. So it's not a real experiment, as a matter of fact, to choose the places with the most appropriate conditions to do the innovation. Of course, there could be a lot of failures, but if there are failures, then that innovation will not spread. But if there is success, then, of course, sometimes other local governments, they will learn. Yeah, because there's that kind of competing relations between the local governments, especially for local economic growth. And when the higher level governments, they're very cautious, they look at that progress. When they see there is success, they try to generalize, they try to summarize. They try to make the innovative practices into policies and even into national laws. Yeah. So, sometimes there's natural spread of the policy of the innovation between the local governments. And in some situations, the central government just make it kind of formal requirement. Okay. So in that way, so policy experiments and policy diffusion could happen with the least costs, in my perspective. Yeah, but now since China's institutional system gets to be more and more mature, we have many, many laws. So to have that kind of policy learning, it gets to be more and more difficult because every time when we do innovations, to some extent, that's a violation of existing regulations or existing, laws and policies. Okay, so the second important factor is the innovation culture. Yeah, at the beginning, because the market is not so mature, so we rely a lot on the government to coordinate, for example, resource allocation, to coordinate the local economic development. Yeah, but governments can make the wrong choices, the wrong decisions. But usually, if there are failures just because of innovation, that could be ignored by the higher level governments. That could be allowed. So there's kind of tolerance of error. Yeah, that kind of, pro-innovation culture also makes a difference. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sean.
These are wonderful questions. I am going to address the methods question. Thank you. Just to bring a few pieces together, Dr. Raadschelders made a point that any time in which you have structured human activity, there's going to be some type of inequity, but we shouldn't accept egregious inequities, is how he put it. I thought that was a really powerful way of putting it. And across the panelists, we see about the importance of learning and innovation and having seats at the table and emotional labor. And to address your two questions in particular, and then I'll get to the others because I can kind of link these together. I have seen instances, you asked the question of evidence or discourses driving this. I have seen instances, such as in policing, where issues that typically bedevil this discussion, such as missing variable bias, sometimes are very expertly mitigated because the data are much more complete than other studies. And the data could say, no, this is a disparity. This population is being stopped, searched, and arrested more than others. But it's still that positionality of the person, regardless of the evidence that says, I don't believe that, I don't accept that, or I do accept that, I do believe that, and the action taken there. And so I agree with you that the evidence says one thing, but the meaning to which we ascribe the evidence and our power and positionality then, of course, impact what agencies do, in my experience. And then your question was wonderful about what can governments do. And I think what we have to do in these instances, we have to put our comparative hats on, and we have to look at instances of governments that have achieved success. I know there's a lot of social construction about the meaning of success. What does that mean? And it's those instances where populations who have historically not been well served by government, who get some sort of policy or administrative change, and they say, okay, that works better. There are instances of that. And in these instances, such as in King County in the United States, which is not perfect, what it always required, whether it's there or whether another issue I study, the outreach to Muslim populations in France or in the United Kingdom, it always required government to change the way it operated. It required government to adopt strategies that it historically had not done in order to break down some of those barriers. An example of this is if you can't reach someone, then you have to change government to go to where they are to get their opinion, their information, their perspective. Example of this is in transportation equity, which is one of our colleagues, Dr. Samantha Larson, writes about a lot. To promote something like transportation equity, you have to have government officials go at 4 o'clock in the morning to the bus stops, to the train stops, and ask people, what's your experience? Because they may not go to those sort of meetings to say, this is my experience. So it's changing the way government operates. And I can't universalize that perspective, but I'm just saying in these instances where there is something successful adopted, it has always required lessening those barriers, changing the way government operates, and going to where people are instead of having them come to government. Exactly.
We'll take follow-ups at the end.
And Dr. Bassoum, I'd love to address I'm also going to write you an email as well, because this is admittedly something to to think about. Keep in mind that these are budgetary officers, and so there's going to be a wide variation in terms of the education that they receive. So many of them would not have received MPA education, and their public service values are a little bit different. But you've already pointed out to something that we've encountered at conferences, which we can say, well, wait a minute, that there could be some self-selection there to a degree, and we already have a follow-up study to investigate. It's going to be qualitative, you know. Hey, qualitative can solve certain problems that quantitative can in a lot of ways, for methodologists in the room. And that's going to be one of our follow-up studies to see the sources of these public service values. I so appreciate your question because that is something that we have to tweeze out. But I'm going to send you an email about it because I'd love to talk with you about this.
Thank you all so much for your patience to stay. I'll leave it to Dr. Shahjahan to close the forum.
Thank you. I think we need to very quickly close, though the discussion is continuing for the almost last 3 hours. First of all, we apologize to you because it is almost 40 minutes over our scheduled time. However, as Dr. Noura said, I think you have been very patient attendees and actively participated. I see there are more than, I think, 50 participants, which is not that usual in an academic discussions. None of you left the room, and you listened what what Dr. Gada said, very rich and diverse discussions, right? And from the US to China and from all these 10 different governments, as well as they showed us about the challenges that we are facing, as well as some hopes and despair situations. And this is probably an issue that we need to continue these discussions. What we started last year, and we succeeded to do it with your help this year. Maybe we'll be continuing this debate and discussions and our learning process in the next year. And this is what I've been discussing with Sean. Most probably the presentations that made today, the presentations we did last year, as well as the presentations, I think we'll be probably calling some papers from interested researchers in order to document them, that this is the debate and discussion that we started in the Middle East, and we would like to spread the information throughout the globe. So we need the help of all of you, and we would be circulating this information very soon. And I think what I understood from Sean, that there is also a book series that dedicated to these particular issues, as well as the Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration would be interested in, if needed, a special issue. But we need to document them in order to see our contributions from the Middle East and how this particular social equity and public policy and its role in public policy and administration spreads over the globe. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank Josh. He's on the screen for the last 3 hours, as well as, yeah, we will take a picture, please don't go away. As well as, I think this time, this conference is in collaboration with NASPAA, with the Chinese network of schools of China Arab schools of network school of public affairs, public policy affairs and administration. What I call to Dean this year that this is probably Chinese version of NASPAA, as well as public administration review. Thank you, Josh, for accepting our request, as well as Journal of Social Equity and Public Administration. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Sean, to make this happen. And thank you all panelists for flown over from many parts of the world. Thank you, Noura, to be a very supportive co-moderator. Thank you, Dean Noha, though she is physically not here. She gave us the platform to organize this event. And all the people who are here, who have been so passionately supporting us, my colleague Monica, our IT team, our AUCTV, and all the people that helped us to organize this one over the last almost 3 months. And thank you, AUC administration, for financially and administratively supporting us. Thank you all. Good day.